Hello, Psych 101. Today's lecture is on consciousness. Consciousness is one of the most important foundational theories in psychology. If we look back at chapter 1, when we were talking about the history of psychology, so many of the original schools of thought in the field focused on consciousness. What is it? How can I define it? What impacts it? And, going into Freud, what is unconsciousness? And how does that impact us as well? So consciousness has always been an important concept, but it's very elusive. As we watch a couple videos of different philosophers and scientists try to define it or explain it more or less, you'll see that it's somewhat elusive in how to define it, or there's a lot of different ways in which you could define it. And what consciousness is very debatable. And then you'll see there's some simple ways to define it, but then it's also very complicated, to get to one idea of consciousness or to even define it in general. It can be very complicated. So we'll go into some of these different ideas of consciousness. All right, I've got 3 different TED Talks for us to watch. We're not going to watch the whole thing. We're just going to watch the first few minutes of each of these TED Talks. I will put links to them. If you're interested to watch the whole thing, please feel free, but you don't have to. So the first one is by David Chalmers. Got the link open right here. You don't need to take notes on this. Let's just watch the first few minutes and then I'll discuss it.
Right now, you have a movie playing inside your head. It's an amazing multi-track movie. It has 3D vision and surround sound for what you're seeing and hearing right now. But that's just the start of it. Your movie has smell and taste and touch. It has a sense of your body, pain, hunger, orgasms. It has emotions, anger, and happiness. It has memories, like scenes from your childhood, playing before you. And it has this constant voiceover narrative in your stream of conscious thinking. At the heart of this movie is you, experiencing all this directly. This movie is your stream of consciousness, the subjective experience of the mind and the world. Consciousness is one of the fundamental facts of human existence. Each of us is conscious. We all have our own inner movie. You, and you, and you. There's nothing we know about more directly. At least I know about my consciousness directly. I can't be certain that you guys are conscious. Consciousness also is what makes life worth living. If we weren't conscious, nothing in our lives would have meaning or value. But at the same time, it's the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe. Why are we conscious? Why do we have these inner movies? Why aren't we just robots who process all this input, produce all that output, without experiencing the inner movie at all? Right now, nobody knows the answers to those questions. I'm going to suggest that to integrate consciousness into science, some radical ideas may be needed. Some people say a science of consciousness is impossible. Science, by its nature, is objective. Consciousness, by its nature, is subjective. So there can never be a science of consciousness. For much of the 20th century, that view held sway. Psychologists studied behavior objectively. Neuroscientists studied the brain objectively. And nobody even mentioned consciousness. Even 30 years ago, when TED got started, there was very little scientific work on consciousness. Now, about 20 years ago, all that began to change. Neuroscientists like Francis Crick and physicists like Roger Penrose said now's the time for science to attack consciousness. And since then, there's been a real explosion, a flowering of scientific work on consciousness. And this work has been wonderful, it's been great, but it also has some fundamental limitations so far. The centerpiece of the science of consciousness in recent years has been the search for correlations between certain areas of the brain and certain states of consciousness. We saw some of this kind of work from Nancy Canwisher and the wonderful work she presented just a few minutes ago. Now we understand much better, for example, the kinds of brain areas that go along with the conscious experience of seeing faces, or of feeling pain, or of feeling happy. But this is still a science of correlations. It's not a science of explanations. We know that these brain areas go along with certain kinds of conscious experience, but we don't know why they do. I like to put this by saying that this kind of work from neuroscience is answering some of the questions we want answered about consciousness, the questions about what certain brain areas do and what they correlate with. But in a certain sense, those are the easy problems. No knock on the neuroscientists. There are no truly easy problems of consciousness. But it doesn't address the real mystery at the core of this subject. Why is it that all that physical processing in a brain should be accompanied by consciousness at all? Why is there this inner subjective movie? Right now, we don't really have a bead on that. Now, you might say, let's just give neuroscience a few years. It'll turn out to be another emergent phenomenon, like traffic jams, like hurricanes, like life, and we'll figure it out. The classical cases of emergence are all cases of emergent behavior. How a traffic jam behaves, how a hurricane functions, how a living organism reproduces and adapts and metabolizes. All questions about objective functioning. You could apply that to the human brain and explaining some of the behaviors and the functions of the human brain as emergent phenomena. How we walk, how we talk, how we play chess. All these questions about behavior. But when it comes to consciousness, questions about behavior are among the easy problems. When it comes to the hard problem, that's the question of why is it that all this behavior is accompanied by subjective experience? And here are the standard paradigm of emergence, even the standard paradigms of neuroscience, don't really so far have that much to say. Now, I'm a scientific materialist at heart. I want a scientific theory of consciousness that works. And for a long time, I banged my head against the wall, looking for a theory of consciousness in purely physical terms that would work. But I eventually came to the conclusion that that just didn't work for systematic reasons. It's a long story, but the core idea is just that what you get from purely reductionist explanations in physical terms, in brain-based terms, is stories about the functioning of a system, its structure, its dynamics, the behavior it produces. Great for solving the easy problems, how we behave, how we function. But when it comes to subjective experience, why does all this feel like something from the inside? That's something fundamentally new. And it's always a further question. So I think we're at a kind of impasse here. We've got this wonderful, great chain of explanation. We're used to it, where physics explains chemistry. Chemistry explains biology. Biology explains parts of psychology. But consciousness doesn't seem to fit into this picture. On the one hand, it's a datum that we're conscious. On the other hand, we don't know how to accommodate it into our scientific view of the world. So I think consciousness right now is a kind of anomaly. one that we need to integrate into our view of the world, but we don't yet see how. Faced with an anomaly like this, radical ideas may be needed.
All right, and David Chalmers goes into a few ideas that are pretty radical that explain the idea of consciousness. So feel free, if you're interested, to finish this video, but you do not need to. What I liked about this video was the idea of how mysterious consciousness still is, how elusive it still is, how undefined it is, and there's still a lot to understand and uncover and learn. I also liked his idea that nothing really in our world, nothing within ourselves would have meaning without this idea of consciousness. So it's so important and foundational to who we are, you know, and our happiness and our health. I also like the idea that to understand it, we need to come up with a way to define it or to explore it that's not just scientific or physical or brain-based or rooted in neuroscience. There's got to be more ways to define it. Now, I don't know if I don't really believe that David Chalmers goes into defining, you know, the other. He states that it needs to be, you know, more than just a science of consciousness, but the ideas he presents are still very much science-based. But I do like the idea that there's got to be more to it. You know, we as humans, yeah, we do value science and the physical parts of the universe and our health. But there's got to be more to it than just the scientific brain-based interpretation. All right, let's move forward to the next video. This is John Cyril. I'm probably pronouncing his last name wrong. And we'll watch a few minutes of this.
I'm going to talk about consciousness. Why consciousness? Well, it's a curiously neglected subject, both in our scientific and our philosophical culture. Why is that curious? Well, it is the most important aspect of our lives for a very simple logical reason. Namely, it's a necessary condition on anything being important in our lives that we're conscious. You care about science, philosophy, music, art, whatever. It's no good if you're a zombie or in a coma, right? So consciousness is number one. The second reason is that when people do get interested in it, as I think they should, they tend to say the most appalling things. And then even when they're not saying appalling things and they're really trying to do serious research, well, it's been slow. Progress has been slow. When I first got interested in this, I thought, well, it's a straightforward problem in biology. Let's get these brain stabbers to get busy and figure out how it works in the brain. So I went over to UCSF and I talked to all the heavy-duty neurobiologists there, and they showed some impatience, as scientists often do when you ask them embarrassing questions. But the thing that struck me is one guy said, an exasperating, very famous neurobiologist, he said, look, in my discipline, it's okay to be interested in consciousness, but get tenure first. Get tenure first. Now, I think I've been working on this for a long time. I think now you might actually get tenure by working on consciousness. If so, that's a real step forward. Okay, now why then is this curious reluctance and curious hostility to consciousness? Well, I think it's a combination of two features of our intellectual culture that like to think they're opposing each other, but in fact they share a common set of assumptions. One feature is the tradition of religious dualism. Consciousness is not a part of the physical world. It's a part of the spiritual world. It belongs to the soul, and the soul is not a part of the physical world. That's the tradition of God, the soul, and immortality. There's another tradition that thinks it's opposed to this, but accepts the worst assumption. That tradition thinks that we are heavy-duty scientific materialists. Consciousness is not a part of the physical world. Either it doesn't exist at all, or it's something else, a computer program, or some damn fool thing. But in any case, it's not part of science. And I used to get an argument that really gave me a stomachache. Here's how it went. Science is objective. Consciousness is subjective. Therefore, there cannot be a science of consciousness. Okay, so that's these twin traditions are paralyzing us. It's very hard to get out of these twin traditions. And I have only one real message in this lecture, and that is consciousness is a biological phenomenon like photosynthesis, digestion, mitosis. You know all the biological phenomena. And once you accept that, most, though not all, of the hard problems about consciousness simply evaporate. And I'm going to go through some of them. Okay, now I promise you to tell you some of the outrageous things said about consciousness. One, consciousness does not exist. It's an illusion, like sunsets. As science has shown, sunsets and rainbows are illusions, so consciousness is an illusion. Two, well, maybe it exists, but it's really something else. It's a computer program running in the brain. Three, no, the only thing that exists is really behavior. It's embarrassing how influential behaviorism was, but I'll get back to that. And four, maybe consciousness exists, but it can't make any difference to the world. How could spirituality move anything? And whenever somebody tells me that, I think, you want to see spirituality move something? Watch. I decide consciously to raise my arm, and the damn thing goes up. Furthermore, notice this. We do not say, well, it's a bit like the weather in Geneva. Some days it goes up and some days it doesn't go up. No, it goes up whenever I damn well want it to. Okay, I'm going to tell you how that's possible. Now, I haven't yet given you a definition. You can't do this if you don't give a definition. People always say, consciousness is very hard to define. I think it's rather easy to define if you're not trying to give a scientific definition. We're not ready for a scientific definition, but here's a common sense definition. Consciousness consists of all those states of feeling or sentience or awareness. It begins in the morning when you wake up from a dreamless sleep, and it goes on all day till you fall asleep or die or otherwise become unconscious. Dreams are a form of consciousness on this definition. Now, that's the common sense definition. That's our target. If you're not talking about that, you're not.
All right. So what I liked about Cyril was that last part, especially. It's a real simple, but I feel accurate way to define consciousness, right? It's all of our feelings, our thoughts, our awareness from the moment we wake up to the moment we fall asleep, and even during sleep. Consciousness. Cyril continues to talk about how consciousness is really just a biological way to define it, but it's more than just biology. Yeah, we could say that, everything is biology, but there's more interpretation needed there. It's not just a biological component. You can look at it that way, but it's more than just that. All right, let's move on to the third and final. This one, I think it's just about 2 minutes. I like the way Antonio Damasio introduced the idea.
Here to talk about the wonder and the mystery of conscious minds. The wonder is about the fact that we all woke up this morning and we had with it the amazing return of our conscious mind. We recovered minds with a complete sense of self and a complete sense of our own existence. And we hardly ever pause to consider this wonder. We should, in fact, because without having this possibility of conscious minds, we would have no knowledge whatsoever about our humanity. We would have no knowledge whatsoever about the world. We would have no pains, but also no joys. We would have no access to love or to the ability to create. And of course, Scott Fitzgerald said famously that he who invented consciousness would have a lot to be blamed for, but he also forgot that without consciousness you would have no access to true happiness and even to the possibility of transcendence. So much for the wonder. Now for the mystery. This is a mystery that has really been extremely hard to elucidate, all the way back into early philosophy and certainly throughout the history of neuroscience, this has been one mystery that has always resisted elucidation, has caused major controversies, and there are actually many people that think that we should not even touch it, we should just leave it alone, it's not to be solved. I don't believe that, and I think the situation is changing. It would be ridiculous to claim that we know how we make consciousness in our brains, but we certainly can begin to approach the question, and we can begin to see the shape of a solution. And one more wonder to celebrate.
All right. So I like the way he introduced that, the idea of consciousness. And as you can see, it's so important, it's so meaningful, but it's still elusive. And yeah, there's simpler ways to define it, which are good, but then it's so complicated still, and there's still so much to understand. All right, let's get back to the PowerPoint here. All right, so as we begin to explore consciousness and understand it, and ultimately try to define it, we can understand that there are so many different ways to understand and to perceive consciousness, from the more physical, scientific, brain-based, neurological approach to a biological approach, or to a more objective interpretation of what consciousness is, to consciousness in a philosophical or spiritual or even religious, subjective or psychological interpretation. It's all of these things, there's so many ways to define and look at it. So let's start with a more physical perspective of consciousness. And this is a very simplistic way to define it. Consciousness, more or less, is either we are awake and conscious, or alive, or we're unconscious, or dead. It's as simple as that when we look at a physical interpretation of consciousness. If you're alive, you're conscious. You're fully conscious. If you're not, you're dead. You're unconscious. That's one way to look at it. Then there are various levels of physical consciousness. I may be sitting in class, or you may be sitting in class, and we may be more or less alert, focused, or tired. We can look at consciousness, and it varies based on that. Also, sleeping, right? We're alive, we're conscious, but it's at a various level, right? When we're sleeping, we may not hear sounds or behaviors or things that are going on around us. So there's a variation of our consciousness at that state. Now, you could say, well, hey, I'm still fully alive, so I'm still fully conscious. But as we begin to kind of interpret it and pick it apart a little bit, you can see there are various levels of consciousness, and sleeping and dreaming is another varied level of consciousness. We're not as alert, we're not as awake. Then, if someone gets a concussion, right? Typically you would describe that as we lose consciousness for a certain amount of time, seconds or minutes, to a more extreme level of consciousness, almost to the verge of unconsciousness. And if we look at it, a spectrum, with one side being consciousness, one side being unconscious, or alive and dead, being in a coma is more on that side of unconsciousness. So again, just another physical interpretation of consciousness, being in a coma. Now I want to kind of revert to another idea. We have the physical states of consciousness, right? Then we kind of look at consciousness as awareness of self, or awareness of the world around us, awareness of others or humanity. And I definitely, being a psychologist, and personally, this is the level of consciousness that I like to explore or study or observe, versus more of the physical, brain-based, scientific or even biological aspects of consciousness. This awareness of self, which definitely has its roots in psychology, is an interest to me. All right, and looking at consciousness as an awareness of self goes back to Plato and Socrates. Buddha even talked about it. Confucius, Da Vinci, Descartes, and Freud, and there were others. These are just some of the main players. Explored in trying to understand what consciousness is. We're gonna kind of start with Freud, because I believe that Freud, when it comes to the foundation of psychology, Freud was, one of the fathers and of consciousness and bringing it into the psychological world. So Freud in the early 20th century, he came up with this interpretation of consciousness. How conscious are we as a species? And you may or may not have heard of Freud's iceberg analogy. And this is kind of rooted in personality, within ourselves, and how conscious are we of ourselves. And Freud, in the early 20th century, he claimed that only 10% of our personality was conscious. So only 10% of who we are were we really aware of. More of who we are, more of the ego, I should say, which is a Freudian term, we're 90% unconscious. So if you look at an iceberg, the whole iceberg analogy is, typically an iceberg is huge, right? But we only see a fraction above water, right? There's a huge chunk of the iceberg underneath the water that we don't see, right? So, or we're unconscious of. So Freud would say, in the sense of personality, or again, awareness of who we are, awareness of self and others, we're only 10% aware. And that was kind of the going theory, starting over the past 100 years, I would say. And I typically would ask in class, we're not going to do it today because I have a different journal for us to do, but I would kind of tend to pose this question, or it interests me. How conscious are we even today? Are we more conscious than Freud's claim, in the early 20th century? Are we less conscious? Are we the same? So I would have you guys journal about this. I'm going to have you journal about something else, but that's kind of a question that interests me. So if you take a second, I'm just curious, what do you think? Do you think we're more conscious than 10%? Do you think we're less? Do you think we're the same? So you could take a second to think about it. Now, I think we are generally more conscious as a species than, over 100 years ago. I don't know what percentage that is, right? Whether we're 15% more conscious, or 20%, or 30% versus that 10% that Freud claimed in the early 20th century. And here's why. I look at consciousness as an evolution over time that ebbs and flows and kind of goes up and down from the birth of humanity to the present moment. And I like to take a series of events, just a handful of events throughout history, to kind of define this idea of consciousness. And there are many, probably hundreds, if not thousands, of different other events that can contribute or be on this timeline. But I'm just going to select it. So the first event, let's just say, this is inaccurate, and this, this time frame would be in 1850. And I'm not a history buff, but in 1850, there was one of the first shifts, or a major shift in consciousness. Deals with the end of slavery, right? This marked an increase in awareness, in the sense of self, of what was right and what was wrong, and ultimately was a major shift in our awareness. Okay. Then we'll move forward to 1920. 1920, the women got the right to vote. If you think back, only 100 years ago, it's only been 100 years that women had the right to vote. Right? This is another major shift in awareness and consciousness of what is right, of what makes us fulfilled and happy and gives us purpose. So another major shift. Skip another 25 years, 1945. We had the end of the Holocaust. And shift another, 15 years, 1960s. We had the Civil Rights Movement. Another major shift in awareness of quality, of what's right, of what makes us happy and fulfilled and gives us purpose. Right? Again, you can see this major shift from here to here, over 100 years. That consciousness, we're not fully conscious, right? We're not 100% conscious that its growth and its movement evolves over time. In 1994, the ending of apartheid. Another shift in awareness of consciousness. I'm going to skip to 2015. At this point, same-sex marriage is legal. Another shift in awareness, equality, what's right. And then even today, 2020, right in the middle of Black Lives Matter, right? Another awakening, shift in awareness and consciousness. We think about, okay, what does 2021 and the future hold? This movement, though, over time, this is consciousness, and consciousness evolves. But this is why I believe that, Freud, in the early 20th century, claimed that we were only 10%. This is where I think we're more than 10%. That we're always evolving. And an idea of what is consciousness. This is what I feel like consciousness is. And again, it's a little bit hard to define. This movement in equality, in what's right, and ultimately what makes us happy and fulfilled is kind of my idea of what consciousness is. It evolves over time. And interestingly enough, what I want you guys to kind of think about is that each one of us, you and me, each one of us have our own movement of consciousness, right? From birth to death. We all have our movement of consciousness and that awareness of self, awareness of what we want in life, what makes us happy, what's going to make us fulfilled, what gives us purpose. And most of us, if we call this kind of midlife, so I'm right here, most of us are probably, over in this range right now, right? In the present. I'm just going to call that N, being the now, the present. And most of us are right here when we think about, time. So we still have a lot of life to lead. And I pose the question kind of, what do you want your consciousness, your evolution of consciousness, your evolution of awareness, the sense of self and self-purpose, what do you want that to look like from now until death? All right, everybody. Well, this concludes the lecture on consciousness. You can go straight into the next page on Canvas, which is the assignment and the journal prompt that has to do with this lecture. And then I also added some extra information. If you have the time to take a look at, you'll see it in the module underneath this on sleep and consciousness, as well as altering consciousness. So feel free to take a look at that, and then you'll see the quiz at the bottom of this module. All right, guys, take care. Bye.